He returned to his old school, expecting to simply reminisce about the past, but one encounter changed everything. The 89-year-old janitor he knew as a child was still working because she had no choice. What he did next, no one could have predicted. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching from. The warm Hawaiian sun cast a golden hue over the city of Honolulu as the car glided through the familiar streets. Buses rumbled along their routes, palm trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the salty scent of the Pacific lingered in the air. Barack Obama sat in the back seat, his eyes scanning the cityscape, the same roads he had once walked as a teenager. He had spent years away, building a life in politics, traveling across the world, making history. But now, for the first time in years, he was back. Not for a speech, not for a political event, but simply to revisit his roots. As they approached the school, he felt a quiet nostalgia settle over him. Punahou School had changed over the years, but in many ways it still looked the same. The grand entrance, the rows of trees lining the campus, the familiar pathways that once led him to classes, to basketball practice, to moments that had shaped him. He had spent so many formative years here, dreaming of the future, never imagining that one day he would return as a former president of the United States. The car slowed to a stop in front of the main entrance. The driver turned back to him, waiting for confirmation before stepping out to open the door. Barack took a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the leather of the seat, his mind wandering through memories of early mornings, late-night study sessions, the sounds of laughter, the weight of textbooks in his backpack. "You sure you want to do this, sir?" the driver asked. Barack smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Sometimes you need to go back to where you started to understand where you've ended up. He stepped out of the car, stretching slightly as he adjusted the collar of his light blue dress shirt. He had dressed casually. Nothing too formal, nothing to draw too much attention. A simple button-up, dark slacks, and the comfortable worn shoes of a man who had walked many roads in his life. As he moved toward the entrance, a few students passed by, their chatter filling the air, the kind of easy conversations he remembered from his own school days. None of them paid him much attention, too absorbed in their own world to recognize him immediately. He was grateful for it. He wanted to soak in the atmosphere first, before the inevitable moment when someone would recognize him, before the quiet visit turned into something larger. Inside, the school was both familiar and unfamiliar. The hallways had been renovated, the classrooms updated with modern technology, but the essence of the place remained unchanged. The air carried that same mixture of books, floor polish, and the faint trace of chalk dust, though whiteboards had long since replaced chalkboards. The principal, a man in his mid-40s with an enthusiastic smile and an easy confidence, greeted him at the entrance. "Mr. President, it's an honor to have you back at Punahou." Barack shook his hand firmly. "Just Barack today," he said with a chuckle. "I'm just here to walk down memory lane." The principal smiled. "Of course. Would you like a tour? A lot has changed since you were last here." Barack nodded, and together they moved through the hallways, the principal pointing out various improvements: the new science wing, the upgraded athletic facilities, the expanded library. Barack listened with genuine interest, but his mind kept drifting, searching for remnants of the past. As they turned a corner, something caught his eye. A janitor, slowly making his way down the hall, methodically pushing a mop across the polished floor. Barack's steps slowed. The figure was small, hunched slightly, moving with a deliberate, careful rhythm. The gray uniform, The sturdy shoes, the familiar way she leaned into the mop handle, it all struck him with a sudden, sharp sense of recognition. He stopped walking. For a moment, he simply watched. The principal, noticing his pause, followed his gaze. "That's Mrs. Rodriguez," the principal said. "She's been here for as long as anyone can remember." The words hit Barack with a strange weight. Mrs. Rodriguez. He hadn't thought of her in years, decades even, but now, seeing her, memories came rushing back with startling clarity. He had been just a boy when he first met her, a quiet, observant woman who had been part of the background of his school days. She wasn't a teacher, she wasn't a coach, but she had been a presence, always there in the early mornings, wiping down desks before students arrived, sweeping hallways when everyone else had gone home. She was the one who had found his lost textbooks when he had misplaced them, the one who had given him a reassuring nod before a big test, the one who had offered small words of encouragement when he least expected them. He hadn't realized it then, but now, standing here, he understood. She had been a part of his story in a quiet, unseen way. Mrs. Rodriguez, unaware of the eyes on her, kept working, moving the mop across the floor in slow, steady motions. Her hair, once dark, was now completely silver, tied back in a neat bun. Her hands, once quick and efficient, moved with the hesitancy of age, but she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity. "She's still working?" Barack asked, his voice quieter now. The principal hesitated. "Yes, she never left. Been here for over 60 years now." Barack felt a pang in his chest. 60 years, he murmured. She was nearly 90 years old, and she was still working. A group of students passed by, their sneakers squeaking against the floor, their voices rising in animated conversation. None of them noticed the elderly janitor, the woman who had spent her life ensuring that the halls were clean, that the school was kept in order. She was part of the foundation of this place, invisible but essential. Barack exhaled slowly. He had come back to relive memories, to reflect on his journey, but he hadn't expected this. He took a step forward, and then another. As he approached, Mrs. Rodriguez looked up, her expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, recognition dawned in her eyes. Her lips parted slightly. "Barack?" He smiled, warmth spreading through him. "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's been a long time." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to make sure her memory wasn't playing tricks on her. Then, ever so slowly, she smiled, her weathered face creasing with lines of joy and surprise. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. And just like that, time folded in on itself. The years, the decades, the distance, they all melted away. Barack Obama had returned to his old school looking for memories, but instead he had found something far more important. For a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other. The hallway around them was filled with movement. Students passing by, a distant bell ringing, the murmur of conversation. But for Barack, the world had narrowed down to just one thing: the elderly woman standing before him. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression wavered between surprise and recognition, her dark eyes scanning his face as if trying to reconcile the image of the grown man before her with the teenage boy she had once known. Barack saw the moment it clicked, the way her lips parted slightly, the way her wrinkled hands gripped the mop handle just a little tighter. "Well, I'll be," she said again, a little stronger this time. "Barack Obama." A warmth spread through him at the sound of his name in her voice, spoken with the same familiarity she had always used, as if no time had passed at all. He smiled. "It's been a long time, Mrs. Rodriguez." She gave a soft chuckle, shaking her head as she leaned a little on the mop. A long time indeed. Never thought I'd see you walking these halls again. Neither had he. He had returned to Punahou School expecting to find memories of his younger self, expecting nostalgia, perhaps even a sense of closure. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to find Mrs. Rodriguez still here, still working, still pushing a mop through the same hallways she had cleaned when he was just another student walking to class. He glanced at the mop, at the worn cloth of her uniform, at the slight tremor in her hands. He remembered her differently, more upright, faster, her presence unnoticed by most students but quietly constant. And yet, standing before her now, he realized she had never really changed. Time had marked her face, had slowed her movements, but she was still the same woman who had kept these halls clean, the same woman who had looked after students in her own quiet way. Before he could speak, she laughed again, a low, warm sound. "Look at you. Last time I saw you, you were still trying to grow into those big feet of yours." Barack chuckled. Some things never change. She looked him up and down, taking in the broad shoulders, the lined face, the hair now dusted with gray. "Guess you grew into them just fine." The principal, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "You two know each other?" Mrs. Rodriguez shot him a glance. "Of course we do. This one used to leave his books everywhere, always losing something, and always running in the hallways when he wasn't supposed to." Barack grinned. "Guilty as charged." The principal smiled, looking between them. "Well, it's amazing to see moments like this. Mrs. Rodriguez is a treasure here at Punahou." "She always was," Barack said, his voice quieter now. Mrs. Rodriguez waved a hand as if brushing off the attention. "I just do my job." Barack studied her for a moment, noting the slight exhaustion in her posture, the way she leaned just a little too much on the mop handle. He felt something tighten in his chest. "How long have you been here, Mrs. Rodriguez?" he asked. She sighed as if the answer carried weight. "Since before you got here, and long after you left." The principal, sensing the shift in the conversation, excused himself, saying something about needing to check on an assembly. That left just Barack and Mrs. Rodriguez standing in the hallway. "You're still working," he said softly, as if he was only now allowing himself to acknowledge it. She nodded. "Somebody's got to keep these floors clean." There was no bitterness in her voice, no complaint, but there was something else, something unspoken. "How old are you now?" he asked gently. She gave him a knowing look, as if she could already tell where his thoughts were going. 89, last time I checked." Barack exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. 89. And still working. He felt an uncomfortable twist of something in his gut. Disbelief, concern, maybe even guilt. He had always thought of Mrs. Rodriguez as a permanent fixture in his memories, as someone forever rooted in the halls of Punahou. But he had never once considered what happened to her after the students left, after the years rolled by. 89, he repeated. "And you're still working full-time?" She shrugged. "Got nowhere else to be." The words were simple, but they struck him. For most people, retirement was a well-earned rest, a time to enjoy the years after decades of hard work. But Mrs. Rodriguez was still here, mopping floors, as if time had never given her the choice to stop. Something about that didn't sit right with him. She must have noticed the change in his expression because she let out another quiet chuckle. "Don't go looking at me like that, Barack. I'm not some helpless old woman." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wouldn't dare." For a moment, there was a silence between them. Then she shifted her weight, resting both hands on the mop. "What brings you back here anyway?" she asked. Barack glanced around at the walls lined with lockers, at the familiar layout of the school that had once been his world. "Just visiting. Thought I'd take a walk through the past." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. "Funny thing about the past," she said, tilting her head. "You go looking for memories, and sometimes you find people instead." He smiled, this time more fully. "Yeah, sometimes you do." She glanced down at her mop, then back up at him. "Well, don't let me keep you. These floors won't clean themselves." He hesitated, then asked, "What time do you get off?" Mrs. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I was thinking maybe we could catch up over some coffee, if you're not too busy." Something flickered in her expression, surprise, maybe even hesitation. But then she gave a small smile. 6 o'clock. I take the bus home." "I'll be here," he said. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then she gave a slow nod. "All right, then. I guess I'll see you at 6. As Barack walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Nostalgia, certainly. Gratitude. But also something heavier, something that settled deep in his chest and refused to leave. He had come back to Punahou expecting to revisit memories of his youth, but he hadn't expected to find Mrs. Rodriguez still here, still working, still quietly sweeping the hallways of a school that had moved on without her. And he certainly hadn't expected to feel this overwhelming urge to do something about it. At precisely 6 o'clock, Barack Obama stood near the main entrance of Punahou School, waiting. The sky was shifting into the warm hues of an early Hawaiian evening, the breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. Students had long since left, their laughter and footsteps fading into the quiet lull that settled over the campus after hours. He glanced at his watch, then towards the entrance of the school building. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared, pushing the heavy door open with some effort. She had changed out of her gray janitor's uniform into a simple floral blouse and beige slacks. Her hair, though still tied back in a neat bun, seemed less severe outside the context of work. She walked carefully, a slight limp in her step, her hands gripping the strap of a modest handbag slung over one shoulder. Barack smiled as he stepped forward. Right on time. She glanced up at him, then down at his car, a sleek black SUV parked a few steps away. She smirked. "I don't usually get rides like this after work." He chuckled. "Consider it a long overdue thank you." She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "All right, then." He opened the passenger side door for her, and she climbed in slowly, her movements careful, deliberate. Once she was settled, he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. As they pulled away from the school, the city unfolded before them. Honolulu had changed over the years. Taller buildings, more traffic, new businesses lining the streets, but in many ways, it was still the same place Barack remembered. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the city pass by with quiet observation, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You still take the bus home?" he asked after a moment. She nodded. "Every day. Been taking it for decades now." "Doesn't it get exhausting?" She let out a small chuckle. "Everything gets exhausting when you get to be my age." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. "Fair enough." After a few more turns, they arrived at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. It was a quiet place, not the kind that would attract crowds or unwanted attention. Barack had chosen it deliberately, a space where they could talk without interruption. Inside, the air was filled with the rich scent of coffee and baked goods. A few customers sat at small wooden tables, reading or working on laptops, paying little attention to the two new arrivals. Barack led the way to a corner table by the window, pulling out a chair for Mrs. Rodriguez before taking a seat himself. She eyed him for a moment before settling in. "Feels strange having coffee with you," she admitted. He raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" She shrugged, glancing around the cafe as if searching for the right words. "You were just another kid once, a lanky, quiet one, always in your own head. And now you're—" She gestured vaguely, as if the weight of his title was too heavy to put into words. He smiled. "Still the same person." She scoffed. "I doubt that." The waitress approached and they placed their orders. Black coffee for her, a cappuccino for him. When the drinks arrived, Mrs. Rodriguez wrapped her hands around her cup, her fingers steady despite their age. "You've been at Punahou for how long now?" Barack asked, stirring his coffee absently. She thought for a moment. 62 years. He exhaled softly. "That's a lifetime." She nodded. "Pretty much." He hesitated before asking the next question. "And you're still working because—" For the first time she looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window. A long silence stretched between them, and for a moment Barack thought she might not answer. But then she sighed, a sound heavy with years of quiet endurance. "Because I don't have a choice." The bluntness of her response caught him off guard. "My pension isn't enough," she continued. "Hasn't been for a long time. Prices go up, bills pile up, and Social Security barely covers the basics. And then there's the medical expenses. That's the real killer." Barack felt a slow, sinking weight settle in his chest. "You don't have family who can help?" he asked carefully. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "My son lives in California. My daughter's in Texas. They've got their own families, their own lives. They send what they can, but I never wanted to be a burden." The word burden made something tighten in his throat. "So you just kept working," he said softly. She nodded. "What else was I supposed to do?" He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw. He had seen poverty in many places, had worked to address inequality on a national and even global scale. But there was something deeply unsettling about seeing it here, so close, in the life of someone he had once known. The woman who had spent her life quietly keeping things in order, who had made sure that students like him had a clean, safe place to learn, was now struggling just to keep herself afloat. "It doesn't seem right," he said finally. She gave him a small, weary smile. "Life isn't always right." Another pause stretched between them. Barack took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a quiet clink. "Have you ever thought about retiring?" he asked. She chuckled, a dry sound. "Every morning when I wake up." He smiled faintly. "Then why don't you?" She gave him a long, measured look. "Because I can't afford to." There it was, the simple, unvarnished truth. For a moment, Barack could only sit there, processing what she had just said. He thought about the long hours she had worked, the decades she had given to the school. He thought about how, at 89 years old, she should be resting, should be enjoying whatever years she had left. Instead, she was still mopping floors. Anger flickered inside him, not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. She must have noticed the change in his expression because she sighed and shook her head. "Don't go feeling sorry for me, Barack. I've lived a good life, worked hard, raised my kids, did what I had to do." He nodded slowly. "I know." But that's just how it is, she continued. Not everyone gets to retire comfortably. Some of us keep going because we don't have any other choice. He exhaled through his nose, staring at his coffee as if it might offer some kind of answer. It wasn't right. And something inside him told him he wasn't going to just let this go. He looked back up at her, his expression unreadable. What if you did have a choice? She frowned slightly. What do you mean? But Barack didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his cup again, taking another slow sip, his mind already moving ahead. He had come back to Punahou to reconnect with his past. Instead, he had found something he hadn't been looking for. Now, there was no way he could walk away from it. The ride back to Mrs. Rodriguez's neighborhood was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. The city lights flickered past the car windows, casting shadows across the dashboard. Barack's thoughts moved as steadily as the traffic, each one settling into place, forming something larger than just concern or nostalgia. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, looking out the window with a quiet contemplation that told him she was lost in her own thoughts. Maybe she was thinking about their conversation at the cafe, about the way he had reacted to her words. Or maybe she wasn't thinking about it at all. Maybe, to her, it was just another evening at the end of another long day. Barack's mind, however, refused to let go of what he had learned. The knowledge that Mrs. Rodriguez, someone who had been a fixture in his life even if he hadn't fully realized it at the time, was still working at 89 simply because she had no other choice, sat heavy in his chest. It wasn't just unfair. It was wrong. When they reached her street, he slowed the car, taking in the modest houses lined along the block. They were older, worn down by time and weather, the kind of houses where the paint peeled a little around the edges, where the porch lights flickered slightly from old wiring. He pulled up in front of her home, a small, one-story house with a narrow driveway and a front yard that had once been carefully tended but now showed signs of neglect. Grass growing unevenly, weeds sprouting along the edges of the path leading to the door. She shifted slightly in her seat, then turned to him. You didn't have to drive me all the way home, you know. I wanted to, he said simply. She studied him for a moment, then sighed, reaching for the door handle. Well, thank you. He watched as she slowly stepped out of the car, her movements careful, deliberate. She closed the door gently, then took a step toward the house. Before she could go any farther, he spoke. Mrs. Rodriguez. She turned back, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. He hesitated for just a second. Then he said, Would it be all right if I visited again? She raised an eyebrow. What for? He smiled, though it was small. I just feel like we have more to talk about. She gave him a long, measured look, as if trying to decipher something behind his words. Then, finally, she nodded. All right, Barack. If you want to visit an old lady, I won't stop you. He chuckled. I appreciate that. She lingered for another second, then nodded once more before turning and making her way up the short path to her front door. Barack waited until she had stepped inside before putting the car in gear and pulling away from the curb. As he drove back toward his hotel, his mind settled into quiet determination. This wasn't something he could ignore. He had spent his life fighting for change, for justice, for a better world for those who had been overlooked or left behind. He had stood on podiums and spoken about opportunity, about dignity, about lifting others up. But this wasn't about policy or politics. This was about one person, someone who had given so much without expecting anything in return. He couldn't just drive away and pretend he didn't know. The next morning, As the sun rose over Honolulu, Barack sat at the small desk in his hotel room, a notepad in front of him, his phone lying nearby. He had made up his mind the night before, and now it was time to figure out how to turn that decision into action. He picked up the pen and started making a list. First, he needed to understand exactly what Mrs. Rodriguez needed. It wasn't enough to assume. He had to know. Was it just financial security, medical care, something else? Second, he had to find out how to provide it in a way that she would accept. She was proud, independent. He had seen it in the way she spoke about her job, about her children. She wouldn't take a handout. It had to be more than that. Third, he had to make sure it was done right, quietly, respectfully. This wasn't about charity. It was about giving her the dignity of choice. He exhaled and picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He made his first call to an old friend, someone who had worked with senior assistance programs, who could help him figure out what resources were available. They spoke for nearly an hour, discussing everything from pension options to medical support to home renovations. His next call was to a real estate contact in Honolulu. He needed an assessment of Mrs. Rodriguez's home, what repairs it needed, what could be done to make it safer, more comfortable. The house had stood for decades, but time had worn it down. If she was going to stay there, it needed to be a place where she could move easily, without struggling to get up steps or navigate narrow hallways. After that, he called a financial advisor. If Mrs. Rodriguez wouldn't accept direct financial assistance, then maybe there was another way. Something structured, something official, something that would provide for her without making her feel like she was taking a gift. By the time he put his phone down, the day had stretched into afternoon, but he felt something settle inside him. A plan was beginning to take shape. That evening, he drove back to Mrs. Rodriguez's house. She seemed surprised to see him again so soon, but didn't turn him away. They sat on her small porch, drinking tea from mismatched cups. He asked her more about her life, about her children, about her late husband, about the years she had spent working at the school. She spoke without complaint, but he could hear the weight in her words, the exhaustion that came from a lifetime of doing what needed to be done, never asking for more. Finally, he set his cup down and met her gaze. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if you could change anything about your life right now, anything at all, what would it be?" She blinked at him, then let out a quiet laugh. "That's a big question, Barack." "I mean it," he said gently. "What would make things easier for you?" She sighed, looking out toward the street where the last of the evening light was fading. "I suppose I'd like to stop worrying so much about bills, about whether I'll be able to keep up with everything." He nodded, taking in her words. She turned back to him, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Why do you ask?" He smiled, though this time there was something more behind it. "Because I think I can help." She watched him carefully, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Then she shook her head with a small, amused sigh. "You always did have a way of making things sound simple." He chuckled. "Sometimes things are simpler than we think." But as he sat there, watching the way she rubbed her tired hands together, watching the way she shifted slightly in her seat to relieve the stiffness in her back, he knew that what he was about to do wasn't simple at all. It was going to take time, effort, care, and he was ready for it. Barack sat at the small desk in his hotel room, tapping the end of his pen against the open notebook in front of him. The page was already filled with notes from the calls he had made earlier, rough sketches of ideas that were starting to take shape. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, the warm glow reflecting off the polished wood of the desk. Outside the window, the city of Honolulu stretched towards the horizon, its skyline dotted with lights, the ocean beyond it calm and endless. He exhaled slowly, pressing the pen against the paper and circling a few words. Security, dignity, choice. Those were the things that mattered most. He had spent his career advocating for people, pushing for change on a massive scale, crafting policies that affected millions. But this was different. This wasn't about legislation or systemic reform. This was about one person. One woman who had spent her life taking care of others in ways that had often gone unnoticed. And now it was her turn to be taken care of. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing, outlining the steps he needed to take. The first problem was financial security. Mrs. Rodriguez's pension wasn't enough to support her, and Social Security barely covered the essentials. He had confirmed as much during his calls earlier that day. He needed to find a way to provide for her without making it feel like charity. Because if there was one thing he had already learned, it was that Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't the type to accept a handout. He thought about setting up a trust in her name, something structured like an annuity that would provide her with a steady income without her having to lift a finger. But he also knew she would question where the money came from. She would ask how and why, and if she suspected he was simply funding it himself, she might refuse it outright. That meant he needed to get creative. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, landing on a name he hadn't spoken to in a while. An old friend from law school who now worked in finance, specializing in structuring charitable funds. He sent a quick message, asking if they could talk in the morning. The next issue was medical care. Mrs. Rodriguez had hinted at her health concerns, but hadn't gone into detail. He needed to know more. How serious were her conditions? What kind of care did she need? And more importantly, what would it take to make sure she received it? He reached for his phone again and called an old colleague from his days in the Senate, someone who had worked extensively on healthcare policy. They spoke for nearly half an hour, discussing different options: Medicare benefits, supplemental programs, private healthcare plans. By the end of the call, Barack had a clearer picture of what needed to be done. Next was her home. He had only been inside briefly, but he had seen enough to know it wasn't in great condition. The small house had been standing for decades, and time had worn it down. The porch steps were uneven, the railing unsteady. Inside, the narrow hallways and outdated fixtures made it difficult for someone her age to move around comfortably. He made another call, this time to a real estate contact he knew in Honolulu. They talked about arranging a discreet assessment of the house, something that wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't make Mrs. Rodriguez suspicious. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel like she was being scrutinized or judged. Finally, there was the question of how to present all of this to her. He knew she wouldn't accept help easily. She had spent too many years taking care of herself, too many years relying on her own strength. If he wasn't careful, she would resist. He had to frame it in a way that made sense to her, in a way that allowed her to keep her pride intact. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw as he stared at the ceiling. Then, slowly, an idea began to form. The next morning, Barack was up early, coffee in hand, as he made his way through a series of meetings and calls. His friend in finance helped him outline a plan for setting up a fund in Mrs. Rodriguez's name, something that would look and function like a retirement account, but without her having to contribute to it. The money would come from a network of donors, old classmates, and faculty members from Punahou, all of whom would be more than willing to contribute if they knew it was for someone like her. He arranged for a quiet medical consultation through a local clinic, ensuring that Mrs. Rodriguez would be given a full checkup at no cost to her. And the real estate contact had already set the wheels in motion for assessing her home, discreetly reaching out to contractors who could make the necessary modifications. By midday, he had the foundation of a plan. Now, he just had to convince Mrs. Rodriguez to accept it. That evening, he drove back to her house. She greeted him at the door with a raised eyebrow, but let him in without question. They sat in the small living room, the air filled with the scent of tea brewing in the kitchen. He didn't bring up his plan right away. Instead, he let the conversation unfold naturally, asking her more about her life, about the things she loved and missed. She talked about her late husband, about the early years when they had just bought the house, about the days when her children were still young. Finally, as the evening stretched on, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said gently, "if there was a way for you to stop working, to finally rest after all these years, would you take it?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I don't know, Barack. I've been working for so long, I wouldn't know what to do with myself." He smiled. "Maybe it's time to find out." She studied him for a long moment. "You're planning something." He chuckled. "I've been known to make plans." She shook her head, sighing. "I told you, I don't take charity." "This isn't charity," he said simply. "This is people giving back to someone who gave so much." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "What exactly are you up to?" He took a breath, then began to lay it out, carefully, methodically, making sure to frame it in a way she could accept. He told her about the retirement fund, about how it wasn't just him, but a whole network of people who cared about her. He told her about the medical checkup, how it was just to make sure she was getting the care she deserved, and he told her about the house, about how some small modifications could make her life easier. She listened, her face unreadable. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then she set her teacup down with a quiet clink. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just let us do this for you." She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I never expected any of this." He smiled. "Neither did I." Another pause, then, finally, she gave him a small, tired smile. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." Barack felt something settle inside him, a quiet satisfaction, a sense of knowing that this was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The work wasn't finished yet. There were still things to arrange, details to finalize. But for now, for this moment, he knew one thing for certain. Mrs. Rodriguez's life was about to change. And this time, she wouldn't have to do it alone. The first signs of change came slowly, almost imperceptibly, in a way that didn't feel forced or overwhelming. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her initial hesitation, allowed Barack's plan to unfold around her, though she remained cautious, wary of accepting too much, too easily. The first real shift came with the medical consultation. A doctor from a local clinic arranged through Barack's quiet efforts visited her home one morning. It was done subtly, under the guise of a free senior wellness program that Barack's contacts had set up to avoid raising her suspicions. She sat in her small kitchen, hands folded over the worn wooden table, as the doctor checked her blood pressure, asked about her health history, and conducted a full assessment. When the results came in, they confirmed what Barack had already suspected. Years of physical labor had taken a toll on her joints, her back, and her overall health. She had arthritis in both knees, early signs of osteoporosis, and untreated high blood pressure. The doctor recommended physical therapy, adjustments to her home environment, and, most critically, rest. Mrs. Rodriguez predictably brushed it off at first. "I've been fine this long," she said, sipping her tea as if the conversation wasn't about her own well-being. "I don't need all that." Barack didn't argue with her. He just listened. And then, slowly, he began introducing changes in ways she could accept. The physical therapy was framed as a simple way to ease her daily aches. A new chair, designed for back support, appeared in her kitchen with no explanation other than, "It was just sitting in storage, figured you might like it." Then came the adjustments to her home. The repairs started small. A few local handymen referred by Barack's real estate contact arrived to fix the sagging porch steps. Mrs. Rodriguez watched them from her window with narrowed eyes, arms crossed, muttering about how she had never needed help with the house before. But she didn't stop them. Then came the railing in the bathroom, the widening of the doorways, the small but significant changes that made it easier for her to move through her own home. Barack made sure everything was done in a way that felt practical, not indulgent. He knew she wouldn't accept luxury, but she would accept necessity. And then, finally, there was the matter of her retirement. The trust fund had been carefully arranged, structured so that she wouldn't have to touch it directly. It simply deposited a monthly sum into her account, just enough to cover her expenses comfortably. It was framed as an expansion of her existing pension, with anonymous contributions from former students, teachers, and community members who had once been touched by her kindness. Barack knew she would never accept it if she thought it came solely from him. When she saw the first deposit, she called him immediately. "Barack," she said, her voice sharp with suspicion, "what is this money?" "It's yours," he said calmly, "from people who care about you. I didn't ask for this. You didn't have to." A long silence stretched between them. He could almost hear her thinking, weighing whether she could allow herself to accept what was being given. Finally, she exhaled. "So what am I supposed to do now?" "You stop working," he said gently. "You rest." Another silence. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she said, "I don't know how." That was the hardest part. For more than 60 years, she had worked. Waking up early, putting on the same uniform, pushing the same mop, wiping down the same desks. She had spent a lifetime taking care of things, of people, of spaces that weren't even her own. The idea of stopping, of stepping back and allowing the world to take care of her for once, was foreign. The following week, Barack met her at Punahou School for what would be her final day. She had agreed, though reluctantly, to retire. The school administration, after some persuasion, had planned a quiet farewell gathering in the staff lounge. Nothing extravagant, just a few colleagues, a cake, and a framed photo of the school, signed by teachers and staff. Mrs. Rodriguez stood near the window, arms crossed, watching as people filtered in. She didn't like the attention, but there was a softness in her expression, a quiet emotion she wasn't ready to name. Barack watched from across the room, letting her have her space. When the principal stood up to speak, the room fell silent. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, smiling warmly, "there's no way to sum up everything you've done for this school. You have been its heart in ways most people will never understand. And while we'll miss seeing you in the halls every day, we want you to know that your presence here will never fade." A quiet murmur of agreement swept through the room. Mrs. Rodriguez exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It's just a job," she muttered, but there was no real conviction in her voice. Barack stepped forward then, smiling at her. "No, it wasn't," he said. "It was never just a job." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. That evening, Barack drove her home. The car was silent for most of the ride, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Rodriguez stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap, her posture relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. When they reached her house, she sat still for a moment before turning to him. "You really did all this?" He met her gaze. "Not just me. A lot of people." She studied him, her dark eyes thoughtful. Then she nodded, as if finally allowing herself to believe it. As she stepped out of the car and walked toward her house, she moved a little slower, but not from exhaustion. It was the careful, deliberate walk of someone who was adjusting to the idea of a life no longer defined by work. Barack sat there for a long time after she had gone inside, staring at the small house, at the porch that no longer sagged under its own weight, at the light that glowed warmly from the front window. For so many years, Mrs. Rodriguez had given her time, her strength, her care to others. And now, for the first time, the world was finally given something back. The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus of Punahou School, the golden light filtering through the palm trees that lined the pathways. The school was already coming to life. Students bustling through the hallways, laughter echoing off the walls, teachers exchanging quiet conversations before the day began. It was a place of movement, of energy, of young lives filled with possibility. But for Mrs. Rodriguez, this morning was different. It was her last. She stood just inside the entrance, holding a small paper cup of coffee in her hand, the steam curling up into the cool morning air. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a simple blue blouse and a pair of neatly pressed slacks. The janitor's keys, which had dangled from her waist for decades, were no longer there. It felt strange, as though she had forgotten something, as though she had walked out of her house missing a piece of herself. Barack arrived a few minutes later. He saw her before she saw him, standing alone, staring down the long hallway she had walked every day for more than 60 years. She was quiet, but he could see the weight of the moment in the way she held herself, in the way she took slow, steady sips of her coffee, as if grounding herself in the routine one last time. He stepped forward, and she turned, sensing his presence. "You came," she said. He smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." She glanced back down the hallway. "Feels strange." "I imagine it does." She took another sip, then let out a quiet chuckle. "You know, I never thought I'd see this day. Not because I didn't think I'd live this long, but because I never thought I'd leave." Barack nodded, understanding the sentiment. Some places become more than just places. They become homes, even if they aren't built for living. They become part of who you are. The faculty lounge had been set up for a small farewell gathering. Nothing extravagant, just a few teachers, a handful of staff members, and a modest cake with blue icing that read, "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez." When she walked in, the room erupted in applause. She blinked, clearly surprised, then shook her head, waving a hand as if trying to brush it off. "Oh, stop that," she muttered, but Barack caught the small smile she was trying to hide. The principal stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said warmly, "I think I speak for everyone when I say that there aren't enough words to thank you for everything you've done for this school. You've been here longer than most of us have been alive, and while the students may not always have noticed you, we did. We saw the way you cared, the way you looked out for people. You were more than just part of the school. You were part of its heart. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the room. Mrs. Rodriguez exhaled, shifting on her feet. It was just a job, she said, but the words felt weak in her mouth. Barack stepped forward then, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. No, it wasn't. She met his eyes, something flickering in her expression. It was never just a job, he continued. You weren't just cleaning floors or locking up classrooms. You were taking care of people. You were making sure the lights stayed on so kids could stay late and study. You were making sure they had a safe place to come to every morning. And you did it all without asking for anything in return. The room was silent now. Mrs. Rodriguez swallowed, looking down at her hands. 62 years, she murmured. It all went by so fast. The teachers gathered around her then, offering their thanks, their hugs, their small tokens of appreciation. Handwritten notes, a framed picture of the school, a scarf that one of the younger teachers had knitted herself. Mrs. Rodriguez accepted them all with quiet gratitude, though she still looked a little overwhelmed by the attention. When the gathering finally ended, and the last of the teachers drifted back to their classrooms, she stood for a moment in the empty lounge, staring at the cake as though she wasn't quite sure what to do next. Barack walked up beside her. You ready? She exhaled. Not sure. They walked through the hallways together, the echoes of the past whispering around them. Every step she took felt like a farewell. The trophy case near the gym, the cafeteria where she had once mopped up 1,000 spilled lunches, the old lockers that still bore the scuff marks of generations of students. When they reached the front doors, she hesitated. Barack watched her, letting her take her time. Finally, she took a deep breath. Well, she said, I suppose that's it. He smiled. Not quite. There's still life after this. She glanced at him, then shook her head with a small, tired chuckle. Guess I'll have to figure out what that looks like. She took one last look at the school, at the place that had been hers for so many years. Then, with quiet resolve, she stepped forward. And for the first time in 62 years, she walked away. The ride from the school was quiet. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing city streets. The morning light spilled through the window, illuminating the fine lines on her face, the traces of a lifetime spent in motion. But now, for the first time in 62 years, there was no destination, no shift to prepare for, no hallway waiting to be swept. Barack stole a glance at her as he drove. He could see it in her posture, the weight of transition, the silent uncertainty of stepping into a life uncharted. Retirement was something most people longed for, something they planned, something they counted down to. But for her, it had never been a question, never an option. She had worked because she had to, because she knew no other way. And now, suddenly, that path had ended. He didn't speak at first. He let her sit with her thoughts, with the enormity of the moment. Instead of turning back toward her home, he took a different route, heading toward the ocean. The streets grew quieter as they neared the coastline, the rush of city life fading into the gentle rhythm of the waves beyond. When he finally pulled into a small overlook facing the water, he put the car in park and turned to her. Thought you might want to see something different today, he said. Mrs. Rodriguez blinked as if shaking herself from a daze. She glanced out the window, taking in the endless blue stretching toward the horizon. A slight breeze rustled through the palm trees, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand. I haven't been out here in years, she murmured. He smiled. Then it's overdue. She hesitated for a moment before reaching for the door handle. Barack stepped out first, walking around to her side just as she climbed out. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the water, the vastness of it. He watched her take a slow breath, as if trying to absorb it all, trying to let it settle into this new reality she hadn't quite accepted yet. They walked toward a wooden bench near the edge of the overlook. The view was uninterrupted, nothing but sea and sky stretching endlessly ahead. She sat down carefully, folding her hands in her lap, while Barack took the spot beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The waves rolled in, steady and sure, the sound of them rhythmic and familiar. Then, finally, Mrs. Rodriguez exhaled a quiet laugh. "Well," she said, "here I am." Barack turned to her. "How does it feel?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Strange, like I should be somewhere else, doing something. It's like—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's like stepping into a house you've never been in, but somehow it's supposed to be yours." He nodded, understanding. "It's going to take time." She sighed, rubbing her hands together slowly. "You know, Barack, I never really thought about this. What comes after work? What happens when you stop moving? When you stop being needed?" He frowned. "You think you're not needed anymore?" She let out a small, dry chuckle. "I spent my whole life making sure things were clean, making sure things were in order. People don't think about janitors much, and that's fine. I never wanted to be noticed. But when you're the person in the background, the person who fixes things when no one's looking, you get used to the feeling that you have a purpose, even if no one sees it." She looked out at the water again. "And now, I don't know. It feels like I left something behind. Like I forgot to lock up one last time." Barack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You didn't leave anything behind, Mrs. Rodriguez. You gave something, 62 years of work, of care, of quiet kindness. That doesn't just disappear because you're not there anymore." She gave him a sideways glance. "You always did have a way with words." He smiled. "I mean it." She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I guess I just don't know what to do now. What do people even do when they retire?" Barack chuckled. "A lot of things. Travel, read, spend time with family. Some pick up new hobbies. Some just rest." She raised an eyebrow. "Rest?" "Yes," he said, amused by her skepticism. "You'd be surprised how nice it is." She shook her head. "I wouldn't even know how to start." "Well," he said, gesturing toward the ocean, "this is a pretty good place to practice." She looked at the waves again, watching the way they moved, endless and unbothered. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I suppose it is." They sat there for a while, the ocean stretching before them, the world still moving, but for once, Mrs. Rodriguez did not have to move with it. In the following weeks, the changes settled in gradually. The retirement checks arrived on schedule, and though she still eyed them suspiciously at first, she didn't refuse them. The house felt different, easier, safer. She moved through it without the same aches, without the same caution. The bus no longer dictated her mornings. The weight of obligation slowly lifted. At first, she didn't know what to do with her time. The first few mornings, she woke up at dawn out of habit, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, unsure of where she was supposed to be. But then, little by little, she let herself slow down. She started taking walks around the neighborhood, something she hadn't done in years. She visited an old friend she had lost touch with. She sat on her porch in the afternoons, watching the world move by without feeling the need to chase after it. One afternoon, Barack visited, finding her sitting outside with a book in her lap. She looked up as he approached, raising an eyebrow. "Well, look at that," she said. "I finally figured out how to sit still." He grinned. "Told you it wasn't so bad?" She shook her head, amused. "I still think it's strange." "Give it time," he said. "You've earned it." She was quiet for a moment, then looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, when you first showed up at the school, I didn't expect any of this." "Neither did I," he admitted. She nodded, as if accepting that answer. Then she looked back at her book, smoothing her fingers over the worn cover. "I guess I should say thank you," she said. Barack smiled. "You don't have to." She smirked. "I know, but I'm saying it anyway." And with that, she turned her gaze back to the street, back to the sky, back to a world that was still there, waiting for her. Not as something she had to take care of, not as something she had to clean or fix, but as something she could finally enjoy. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch more videos like this and share it with others who might find it inspiring.